Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobby, and today there's trouble brewing in Italy. There's a massive flight from Italian government bonds as the country is set to head back for another emergency election. So is this the Maastricht Treaty finally getting its comeuppance? That's what we asked today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. Well, as we are recording this, Italy is in meltdown. People can't get rid of their Italian government bonds fast enough, which means they've seen the price drop, and of course that pushes up the yield. Normally the yield on government bonds moves at best a few basis points in a day, maybe 7 or 8 hour push. But in one day, Italian 2-year government bond yields rose 190 basis points. Why? Well, because it looks like the Populist League and Five-Star parties can't form the government they wanted to form. The president has vetoed their choice of prime minister and finance minister, but he's put a classic monetarist into the role. The parties are threatening to impeach the president, and it looks like they're going to be going to the polls as soon as July, with the populist parties gaining more support in the opinion polls. So, Steve, I know you're going to say I told you so I'm going to let you do that. But also, tell us why this is happening.
Okay. Well, actually, I said them first when I wrote the first edition of Debunking Economics, and I described the Maastricht Treaty. That was back in 2000, 2001, so it's just after the Euro began. And I described the Maastricht Treaty as a collective suicide note by the countries of Europe. And I can't say I was the first person to make a criticism like that, because two diametrically opposed economists made much the same argument. My favourite is Wynne Godley, who was the father of the whole modern post-Keynesian approach to economic modelling called stock-flow consistent modelling. And writing back in 1992, literally as they were drying the ink on the Maastricht Treaty, he wrote a wonderful paper which is still available. You can get it from the London Review of Books. It's called Maastricht and All That. And at the end of it, he says that if you give up the opportunity to devalue a currency, which is what you do by forming a currency union like the euro, and you don't have a nation-state level treasury, like a European level treasury, enabling taxes and spending to balance out what happens with flows of goods and services and money in ordinary transactions, then there is nothing. And you also enforce the austerity rules of the euro, which won't let a country spend more than 3% of GDP is in excess of government spending over taxation revenue, so there is nothing to stop a region suffering the process of terminal decline, leading in the end to immigration. Immigration is the only alternative to poverty or starvation.
Which is what we've been seeing in Greece, of course. We've been seeing massive emigration from Greece, and yet no one seems to talk about it too much.
That's right. I mean, they're ignoring the fact that the only way to survive what the European Union is doing to the deficit, internal deficit, trade deficit countries within Europe, is people are leaving. It's depopulation. It's not just in the actual existing EU. I was in Croatia about a year ago, and I was driven from Zagreb down to Pula by the people who invited me to speak there. And we were going through village after village, and they were saying these villages are empty now. And I said, what's going on? So the activity has collapsed, and people have just emigrated. They left the country. So the whole impact of trying to impose what the European Union believed was sound finance is the depopulation of large parts of Europe.
So, and it is the problem being a half pregnant cow with the euro, isn't it? I mean, we haven't gone all the way of the United States, where it really is a United States, and you have a central bank and a government working hand in hand to try and deal with the tools they have available. Here, you've got a whole load of disparate governments with only limited access to those tools and a central bank, which possibly, dare I say, it might be a little bit German and France focused.
That's the trouble. I mean, because the whole focus of you've got to look at the history of Germany, and of course, whenever anybody talks about what I see as genuinely sound finance, you get what about the Weimar Republic line? Well, that scarred Germany's collective memory so heavily that they are terrified about inflation and do anything to try to prevent it. And part of it was the idea that government should basically live within their means, that whole idea which you'll find in England as well, of course. And that meant they were trying to restrict government spending. Now, what they did with it was restrict the creation of money by governments. and leaving it only to the private sector. So it was a recipe for a private debt bubble, which burst when the global financial crisis came down in Italy, in Spain, and virtually everywhere else, where private money creation made up for the absence of government money creation. And it's been a catastrophe.
So, if Italy wasn't part of Europe now, what would they be doing if they saw that the economy just wasn't growing, wasn't keeping up, that there was rising unemployment, people weren't buying stuff? What would be the reaction of the Italian government? How would they get out of this mess if they weren't bound to the euro?
Well, they'd simply have an increase in government spending because of an increase in the level of unemployment. They'd have a decrease in taxation because of fallen profits. They'd have to issue more bonds to finance that, which the Central Bank of Italy would then they'd be sold to the financial sector in Italy, and then if the central bank bought those bonds off the financial sector in open market operations, that would create additional money. The normal story ends up being that just by the whole process of open market operations in America, for example, for the last 120 years, on average, the government deficit's been 2.4% of GDP, and it would just create the additional money which would circulate in the economy. And so this, in fact, there is no downturn, there is no crisis that preceded this. The crisis is preceded by is caused by the monetary system itself this time round. But yeah, it'd just be a normal, operation. What Keynes used to call the automatic stabilizers would be kicking in, and we wouldn't be talking about Italy.
Yeah. Put simply, if private spending is down, you increase public spending, and then when things kick in, you can start to turn it back a little bit. You can't. You can't turn both down at the same time.
Yeah, and that's unfortunately what the Maastricht Treaty actually requires the countries to do. When the private sector turns down, then the government deficit rises, and the Maastricht Treaty requires you to cut the government deficit, which means private spending has fallen, and the Maastricht Treaty forces you to reduce government spending as well, and the economy declines. And this is the fallacy of so-called sound finance.
So Italy can issue bonds. Well, they do issue bonds, so they do issue their own debt. But the ECB has to. Well, if they issue debt, it gets bought. It either gets bought by private investors or it gets bought by the European Central Bank. Now, the European Central Bank is not going to buy bonds if they see too much of it being issued and it's not meeting their stipulations. And I guess that's part of the problem, isn't it? It's sort of stopping them from issuing those bonds now.
Yeah, I mean, because at the moment the only thing that the ECB is only required to buy government bonds if the conditions of the Maastricht Treaty are met.
Yeah.
And those conditions included private government debt being less than 60% of GDP, and the deficit being in a particular year being less than 3% of GDP. Now, what's happened with the crisis is that Italy's, after the financial crisis hit, that deficit's been as high as 15% of GDP, and that's simply because tax revenues plunge during a downturn and government spending rises. So the ECB was under no obligation to buy more than 3% of GDP worth when they were issuing 15% of GDP worth. And that's why you had these astronomical valuations for not valuations, but the astronomical interest rates on the bonds. And that Draghi came in and said he'll do whatever it takes, which means he would actually go beyond the legal mandate he has and buy whatever's necessary to reduce the bond prices. That's what stopped the crisis last time round. So the only way the crisis was prevented back when it hit in, I think 2012 or thereabouts, was Draghi saying, I'm not going to abide by those rules. Now, nobody said, oh, you naughty Draghi, we've got to go and take you and cane you. So when it suits the European authorities to try to hang on to the euro, they will break the rules of the euro. And in fact, they broke the rules of the euro in the very first place by allowing Italy in, because unlike Greece, which had a lot of help, I think it was Goldman Sachs, to hide the amount of debt that it had, everybody knew that I think Italy's level of government debt when the crisis began was about 110% of GDP. So even though the rule said it must be below 60% and must have a 3% ceiling, right from the outset, Italy didn't meet those rules, and nothing was done between 2000 and 2007. So it just shows that the whole thing is more of a political system than an economic one, driven by the so-called political imperative to unite Europe to stop wars occurring. But I think it's uniting Europe and causing wars.
Right, and there's a lot more to this discussion about what is unfolding in Italy. What can the ECB do? What can the EU do? What can Italy do? And what is likely to happen? What are the next steps? We'll discuss all of that in the full version of this podcast, which you can hear by subscribing at debunkingeconomics.com and picking one of the subscriptions on the right-hand side on the front page of the website, or by supporting Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. If you provide $10 or more support per month, then you get access to this and all the other podcasts. There's well over 100 now in this series. We hopefully will see you back here again very soon to hear the full version of this podcast. I'm Phil Dobby. Thanks for listening.